Hi, this is Jeremy,
Hi, this is Rachel.
and we're talking about Bread and Puppet Theater.
Yeah.
It's an American avant-garde um, theater that's been around since the 60s.
Yes.
One quote that Peter Schumann said is, "We are Bread and Puppet Theater because we offer good sourdough rye bread together with a variety of puppet shows, some good, some not good, but all for the good and against the bad. The art of puppetry helps women, men, and children alike to overcome the established order and the obsessive submission to its politics and consequent brutalities." A lot of Peter Schumann, like all the shows are basically political, and they go with a lot of causes, which we'll talk about later. Another thing about the sourdough rye bread is from a teacher that I had. She said that once you walk into the building, all you smell is garlic butter. It reeks, I heard.
So the Bread and Puppet Theater was founded by Peter Schumann, who was born in on July no, sorry, June 11th, 1934 in Lublin, Poland. And he's now 83 years old. He's not dead, right?
No, he's not. He's still alive. Amazingly. Still writing his own plays for the theater company.
Mm-hmm. And he was educated at the Berlin University of the Arts. And while he lived in Germany, he was a sculptor and a dancer. And he eventually moved to the United States in 1961. And he has had a prolific career, and some of the awards he's received over time include the Obie Award for Special Citations in 1966, the Obie Award for Lifetime Achievement in 1978, and the Guggenheim Fellowship for Humanities in 1986.
And I believe that is a current picture of what he looks like right now.
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't look that old.
No.
I would say maybe late 60s, but 83. Bread and Puppet Theater, obviously founded by Peter Schumann in 1963. The first shows that Bread and Puppet Theater produced were based on concerns in New York City, Lower East Side. They had to do with rent, rats, police, all the above that New York had issues with. One of the oldest it's one of the oldest nonprofit self-supporting theatrical companies in the country, and they engage questions on war, the environment, and capitalism, all through, again, politics. These are some of the performances they do. Their puppets are huge, and as you can tell, they are paper mache. It would be really interesting to see how they do their shows.
And they usually perform them in these huge open spaces and outdoors so they can use these huge puppets and so they can reach a wider variety and a bigger audience. So in the late 60s, Peter Schumann and his partner were offered a position to be a theater in residence at Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont. And Peter really liked the idea of moving to the country and out of New York. So he took up the position, and Goddard was an experimental school with a tradition of progressive education. And so they were really current in what they were teaching and didn't really follow what a lot of other schools in the country taught during this time period, during the 60s. And he only stayed at the school for a few years, and then in 1974, the Bread and Puppet Theater moved to a farm, the Kate Farm, or no, the Bread and Puppet Theater was situated on the Kate Farm in Plainfield, Vermont, but it moved to a different farm in Glover, Vermont in 1974. And there they bought a 140-year-old barn on the property and transformed it into a museum for all the veteran puppets that they had, and that's where they store them.
It's a fact that one of the events that they went through, some of the puppets got arrested by the police. I don't understand how you can arrest a puppet.
I don't know. They must have been doing something pretty bad.
So the manifesto, which is their, I guess you would say, reason for being around, it says, the Why Cheap Art Manifesto, people have been thinking too long that art is a privilege of the museums and the rich. Art is not business. It does not belong to banks and fancy investors. Art is food. You can't eat it, but it feeds you. Art has to be cheap and available to everybody. It needs to be everywhere because it is the inside of the world. Art soothes pain. Art wakes up sleepers. Art fights against war and stupidity. Art sings hallelujah. Art is for kitchens. Art is like good bread. Again, bread and puppet. Art is like green trees. Art is like white clouds and blue skies. Art is cheap. I have to do this. Hurrah! Bread and Puppet, Glover, Vermont, 1984. So this manifesto was created in 1984, as you can tell.
But I think it still applies to what the Bread and Puppet Theater stands for today, in that
Yes.
they don't really want to do this for a profit, kind of like what other theaters do. And yeah. So some of the common bread and puppet themes portrayed throughout their plays do concern the politics and current state of the world. And it's usually said that they try to portray the gross ugliness and the ugliness of the contemporary world. And through their plays, they try to create an existing better world. And the Bread and Puppet Theater aims to show humanity at its truest form. And they do that by showing how all humans are bound together by common guilt for the past and collective responsibility for the human and global future. And usually the shows have huge overarching themes like good and evil or life and death. And also, because their performances usually take place in wide open spaces or just in public or on the streets, Peter Schumann had said that theater should be seen by many people, and that's a big theme that reoccurs throughout many of their plays and through how their plays and performances are put on.
I feel like a lot of theaters would want many people to see the shows, but I feel like for Bread and Puppet, they would want a bigger audience because for how big their shows are, meaning by like how tall the puppets are and all that, like they need the big open space again. Here are some of the causes that Bread and Puppet fight for. Specific causes over the years that have been anti-war. They want to shut down the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant. The support for the Sandinista National Liberation Front Revolution in Nicaragua, 1979 through 1990. That's a long time. The Zapatista Uprising of 1994. The MOVE organization. Opposition to registering for the draft. Opposition to the World Trade Organization. So those are the biggest causes that they have fought for.
And over time, the causes have, as you know, certain issues arise in the world. The Bread and Puppet Theater has adapted, and they adopt new causes into their plays, like how the registering for the draft would have been probably back in the 60s during the Vietnam War. And then some of the other issues that they are concerned with are more current.
I'm waiting right now for them to do something about Trump.
Oh, yeah.
I'm expecting it since it's so political.
Oh, yeah.
Because you can easily make a paper mache look like him.
So the company the Bread and Puppet Theater Company, they used to be situated just in Vermont, but now they tend to make most of their income by touring and using new and old productions, and they tour in America and they also tour overseas. And sometimes the performances occur in the streets, and they usually do occur in the streets. They used to occur in tiny storefronts and loft, sometimes in a theater, but most often in streets or city parks. That's where they used to perform in New York City. But nowadays they still perform in very public spaces, and usually the company allows volunteers to help with the performance. And they are currently on tour in Europe for 2017.
So, like I said in the beginning, all the productions that they have done are written by Peter Schumann. So it makes you think, when Peter Schumann meets his end, what are they going to do?
Yeah.
Who's going to make a new play? Who's going to take over the company?
Yeah. I don't know. He doesn't seem to really have a specific successor or anything yet.
Yeah. So members of the company, they are puppeteers in the company that are completely dedicated to the craft. They work 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. That's a lot. They devote their time to creating shows, building puppets, touring, and rehearsing, etc. I feel like building a puppet would take forever because of how big they are.
Yeah, they're huge, and because they make them using like natural, I don't want to say ingredients, but materials.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I could understand that. And they must make do with all they have in rural Vermont.
Yeah.
And that's the bus that they travel into. Colorful. I hope they don't fit all the puppets in there.
Oh, no. I think sometimes they tend to make the puppets where they go.
That'd be cool.
So, as we were saying, the puppets are all made by hand by members of the company. Originally, the puppets were made, and they're still made, from clay in riverbanks, and the clay was laced with beer and straw. And sometimes they use other natural materials like earth, trees, sometimes bones, and they extract pigments from other natural materials to create every part of the puppet. And eventually they're all molded together to become these huge papier-mâché puppets. And those are some pictures of some of the bigger puppets that they have.
That'd be really interesting to see how they would make each puppet. Or if they would make them in front of the audience in general.
Oh yeah, that'd be cool.
So with the performance spaces, New York is one of the main ones where they performed where they could in New York. Vermont, they performed in Plainfield, which is where they began performing, at the edge of the largest field on Kate Farm. In Glover, they set up a ring in the Glover Amphitheater, and they began performing in county fairs and festivals.
And then eventually that led them to begin touring after they had migrated out of Vermont. And so some of the audiences that the Bread and Puppet Theater have performed for over the years, they generally perform for larger audiences, and it began where the numbers were small, maybe in the hundreds, and early audiences consisted of local Vermonters and New York City fans. And eventually, through combining with the local festivals and concerts, audience sizes grew. And in the late 90s, audiences could include up to 40,000 people, and these numbers usually only occurred when the Bread and Puppet Theater created their domestic resurrection circus, which we're going to talk about in a bit, which was like a summer festival, and that was where thousands of people would come to Vermont and to watch the Bread and Puppet shows. And as audiences grew and shifted, some problems arose with these growing numbers of people, and there was a need to crack down on drug use at performances and many other problems, including people bringing their dogs to performances and the dogs creating waste everywhere, and many other things.
One thing about the audience, they got chances to volunteer with the theater company, where they got to help move the puppets and all.
Right.
So with Bread and Puppet Theater and the counterculture, it began producing a circus Glover.
They began producing a circus in Glover. Yeah.
It began as a small event for Vermont locals. It grew tremendously. It was the biggest fundraiser for the theater, as she said before, 40,000. It focused on a specific theme each year. I'm pretty sure they're bringing that back in Europe soon.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think that's on their tour schedule. It lost its original purpose, and audiences turned it into a sort of a festival. Peter Schumann eventually stopped the festival in 1998.
So this was a huge thing for the Bread and Puppet Theater, and it was called the Domestic Resurrection Circus, as I mentioned before, and the company, it was like we said, their biggest fundraiser because of the huge audiences, and then eventually, like we said, it became kind of a counterculture to what was happening during the time, because instead of coming to watch the theater that the Bread and Puppet Theater were putting on, audiences would sometimes come for other festivities and not even come to see the plays, because the surrounding farms would donate their land so people could park there and eventually go see the shows. But because there were so many people coming, they eventually began to grow it into a sort of festival where there were vendors, and there were other performances, and there were concerts, and it became a whole weekend event that was somewhat like Woodstock. And it was, instead of being branded as a controversial theater production, it was branded by newspapers usually as a 60s nostalgia weekend that was similar to Woodstock. And it pretty much brought about its own downfall, because it had grown so much, and it was good for the company because they got to see, or a lot of people got to see their plays, but then because it had turned into this altogether sort of, it wasn't focused on theater anymore, Peter Schumann was forced to shut it down.
I feel like Bread and Puppet Theater should come back to Pittsburgh and